What if I told you that hidden under the floorboards of a forgotten church in the forests of upstate New York lay 143 unmarked graves? Not just graves, bodies, every single one showing signs of brutal torment, bones that had been broken, healed, and broken again, scars of drowning, carvings etched into the very skeletons themselves. For more than a century and a half, the truth behind those graves was locked away in sealed federal files. Only a handful of people were ever allowed to see what really happened, until now. I've obtained records never meant for public eyes, and what they describe may be the darkest religious cult in American history. The place was Ravenwood, a tiny, unremarkable settlement about 40 miles north of Albany. Back in the early 1800s, it was just 300 or so people working the land, cutting timber, trading with nearby towns. But Ravenwood sat in the middle of something much bigger, a wave of religious fever historians now call the Second Great Awakening. Preachers were crisscrossing the country. New denominations were being born almost overnight, and entire towns were swept up in visions of salvation, prophecy, and fire from heaven revival meetings. And into that storm, in the summer of 1825, came three brothers. They called themselves Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. Ezra, the oldest at 42, carried himself like a man used to being obeyed. His eyes were dark, the kind that seemed to stare straight through you, like they already knew your sins. Silas, the middle brother, looked like a scholar, thin, quiet, glasses perched on his nose, always with ink-stained fingers from writing sermons and sacred instructions. And then there was Caleb, the youngest and the most unsettling. He spoke softly, almost in whispers that somehow carried across entire rooms. His pale blue eyes would roll back during what he called divine visions, moments that left witnesses both awed and deeply uneasy. The brothers didn't come empty-handed. They bought a large piece of land just outside town and immediately began building what they named the Church of the Pure Spirit. This wasn't your typical New England meeting house. No white clapboard, no cheery windows. This church was dark, pole stone pulled from nearby hills, octagonal in design with 8 smaller chambers branching off a central sanctuary. A tall steeple rose higher than seemed reasonable for such a remote village. Most unsettling of all, no windows in the main sanctuary. Services were lit only by lanterns, carefully placed to cast eerie patterns across the stone walls. "We've been called here by the Spirit," Ezra declared at their very first gathering, a crowd drawn mostly by curiosity. In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, he preached, "We bring the true message of purification through tribulation. This community shall be the cradle of a new understanding." And he meant every word. 1825 was a time when old churches were losing ground. New faiths, emotional, fiery, personal, were exploding across America. Methodists, Baptists, even entirely new religions were gaining thousands of followers. Just a few years later, less than 100 miles away, Joseph Smith would publish the Book of Mormon. People were searching, and the Ravencrofts knew exactly how to speak to that hunger. Their teachings sounded simple at first. Salvation, they said, could only be achieved through suffering, not symbolic suffering, not prayerful reflection, but real, physical pain, flesh. Silas explained in calm, careful tones, is the vessel of sin, and only when the flesh is tested, broken, purified, can the spirit soar. To some it sounded extreme, to others it sounded holy. Within the first year, their congregation grew fast. Membership wasn't open to just anyone. Every new convert had to sit with Prophet Caleb for a private discernment session, where he would decide if they were worthy of becoming a vessel for purification. And people came from every corner of society, the poor, desperate for purpose and belonging, the guilty, seeking redemption for sins they could never forgive themselves for, the wealthy, restless with ordinary faith, craving something deeper, stranger, more powerful. One of the first was Margaret Wilkins, a widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever. In her journal, later recovered by federal agents, she wrote, "I had been thinking of ending my life when Elder Ezra found me in town. He looked at me like he could see every thought I'd ever had. He told me my pain had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair." By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had nearly 100 members. Some moved into simple houses on church property. Others kept their homes in Ravenwood, but spent most of their time at the compound. The Ravencrofts encouraged donations, property, savings, worldly goods, claiming that attachments to the earth held back the soul. For the most loyal, a special honor awaited, becoming vessels. The spirit. But with that title came harsher purification rituals. At first, they were mild fasting, overnight prayer vigils, icy water meant to symbolize the drowning of the sinful self. But like the fabled frog in slowly boiling water, the followers didn't see what was happening. Rituals grew longer, stranger, more painful, more dangerous. Step by step, the Ravencroft brothers led their flock toward a darkness no one would escape. What happened next, the final stage of their salvation, would horrify the nation once it was discovered. If you're ready to uncover how faith turned into torture, how loyalty became death, stay with me, like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of the Past. And don't go anywhere. The next chapter of this story will change the way you see American history forever. By 1829, the Ravencroft brothers had full control, not just over their followers' beliefs, but their every move, every thought, every breath. That's when they started digging beneath the dark stone church, hidden from the eyes of Ravenwood. An entire network of chambers began to take shape. Prophet Caleb was overheard in a private meeting, years later documented in seized files, whispering to his brothers, "The sheep are gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd." But their definition of shepherd wasn't protection. It was sacrifice. And the night it all changed, December 21st, 1829. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year. What happened that night would be remembered in secret church records as the first ascension. Banned. It set the template for every horror that followed. It started with a sudden announcement. Elder Ezra claimed Prophet Caleb had received a vision, a revelation straight from the Spirit itself. Everyone was summoned. By nightfall, nearly 150 followers packed into the cold, windowless sanctuary. Breath turning to mist in the lantern light. Only 12 massive candles burned, placed carefully at the edges of a huge spiral carved into the wooden floor, each flickering shadow drawing eyes toward a central platform. Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith who'd joined just months earlier, would later escape and testify. He described what happened next. Elder Ezra's voice, calm at first, grew wild, fevered. "Brothers and sisters," he cried, "the Spirit is impatient. What you've endured so far, the fasting, the vigils, they were nothing but preparation. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation, and it demands more than courage. It demands surrender." And then Caleb appeared. Witnesses swore he looked like another creature entirely, skin pale as wax, movements stiff and jerking, eyes rolled so far back only white showed. He began speaking, not in English, but in some strange, guttural, high-pitched language that echoed off the stone like it came from somewhere else entirely. Minutes of this, then silence. Caleb collapsed, and when he rose, he spoke clearly, but with a voice so commanding that even skeptics felt pulled toward it. "The Spirit," he declared, "has chosen 3 among you for the honor of first ascension." He called their names: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters, 3 relatively new converts, 3 lives about to be destroyed. Deacon Silas led them to the platform, and then, Hartford said, the ceremony became something he couldn't believe. Terror was happening in any civilized place. Each was stripped down to thin underclothes, the winter air biting their skin. They were bound, not upright, but 2 wooden frames shaped like inverted crosses. Ezra addressed the crowd again, explaining that turning the holy symbol upside down wasn't blasphemy. It was symbolic reversal, pride into humility, comfort into pain, life into death, and, he promised, death into rebirth. And so began what they called the 7 trials of purification. First, the trial of air. Wet cloths over their faces. Water poured slowly until the sensation of drowning overwhelmed them. Then the trial of earth. Churchyard soil packed tight around their necks and chests, burying them alive for moments that felt like forever. Next, fire. Heated metal pressed briefly into flesh, leaving precise burn marks, deliberate patterns. Then water. Again, but worse. They were plunged into ice-cold basins until they went limp, then dragged out, revived, and submerged again. Hartford's account falters here. He admitted vomiting, nearly fainting, unable to describe the last 3 trials in detail. but others later confirmed the screaming never stopped, and through it all, the congregation was ordered to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." And they did. Some cried quietly, some looked away, but many, too many, watched in awe, as though witnessing a holy miracle rather than raw human agony. Years of conditioning had done its work. Pain now meant progress. Suffering meant salvation. By dawn, the 3 chosen vessels hung limp, barely breathing, but alive. Ezra raised his hands and declared, "They are emptied of sin. Now they will be filled with the pure Spirit." Prophet Caleb stepped forward. He placed his hands gently on each head, leaning close, whispering something no one else could hear. And then chaos. Each body convulsed violently, backs arching, bones cracking under their own strain. Eyes snapped open, bloodshot, bulging, and from their throats poured the same strange, inhuman language Caleb had spoken earlier by sunrise. All 3 were dead. Ezra smiled. He called it a triumph. Their souls, he claimed, had bypassed judgment entirely, accepted directly into heaven. Their bodies, he told the congregation, were now sacred relics, empty shells, proof of God's favor. And so they weren't buried. Instead, the 3 corpses were carried below, into those freshly dug chambers, laid on cold stone slabs, on display for the faithful to pray over, to long for, to envy that the first ascension had begun. And the blood of Ravenwood would not stop there. If you're still here, and I hope you are, this is only the beginning. According to documents seized decades later, those 3 ascended souls were just the beginning, the first of what would become hundreds, hidden beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit, in a labyrinth of stone and shadows that no outsider ever saw. The morning after that first ascension, a few members quietly slipped away from Ravenwood, too shaken to stay. Thomas Hartford was one of them, but for years he kept silent. He didn't think anyone would believe what he had witnessed. Not in God-fearing, church-going America. Those who stayed behind, they didn't recoil, they drew closer. The brothers had crossed a line straight into murder, and instead of losing control, they tightened their grip. Death wasn't tragedy anymore. It was ritual, as Prophet Caleb reportedly whispered to his brothers afterward, a confession later, repeated in court by a church elder who turned against them. "We've shown them the true face of God, and they didn't turn away. There's nothing they won't accept from us now." And he was right. That night wasn't an ending. It was the start of a 30-year nightmare, hidden in plain sight behind the mask of faith and charity. From 1830 to 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit evolved. Outwardly, it was a pillar of community life, generous, pious, respected. They donated to orphanages, hosted revivals, spoke on temperance, played the part of God's humble servants. But underground, literally underground, their theology, bare rituals, their cruelty grew sharper, bolder, deadlier. The simple cellars under the church, became catacombs. At first, locals dug them. Later, only trusted members were allowed to work in those tunnels. Eventually, only the so-called vessels of the spirit, the utterly loyal, were permitted to touch the earth beneath. RAVENWOOD. By 1835. Those catacombs held 7 great chambers and dozens of smaller alcoves, each one serving a precise, terrible purpose. The chamber of preparation, isolation cells, where chosen candidates were kept for days, broken down mentally and spiritually. The chamber of trials, where the 7 purifications took place. The chamber of ascension, where life ended in the name of elevation, and worst of all, the chamber of saints. That was where they kept the dead, not buried, preserved. Some were partially mummified. Deacon Silas, they said, had learned the techniques from medical manuals. Others were stripped to pure bone, carefully cleaned, then reassembled like grotesque art. Bodies posed in prayer. Skeletons wired into frozen ecstasy. A silent, holy congregation of the dead. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832, Bend escaped 12 years later, described the first time she entered those tunnels. "The smell hit me first," she told federal investigators. "Not rot, something worse, chemicals, alcohol, something sweet I didn't recognize. They called it the perfume of sanctity. Later, I learned it was embalming fluid. New recruits weren't shown everything at once. They were eased in step by step, first told about symbolic chambers, then shown the less disturbing rooms. Pound, and only later. The saints, by the time they saw the corpses displayed like relics, they were too far gone to scream. "I remember crying," Carver said, "not from fear, from joy. I thought I was looking at heaven's proof. Now those tears shame me more than anything." And the killings, the elevations, became routine. In 1830, there were just 2 ceremonies. 5 deaths by 1835, quarterly rituals, 2 to 4 lives each time. By 1840, monthly ascensions, and on solstices and equinoxes. Even more. At first, they chose the expendable widows, orphans, drifters. But as their power solidified, they started looking inward. Families competed for the honor to give a son or daughter to the spirit. It was sold as the highest devotion. Carver remembered. Parents begged, offered their children with pride. We believed it was mercy. We believed it was love. Inside the trio, roles stayed the same. Ezra, the voice; Silas, the scholar; Caleb, the prophet. But Caleb's power grew. His visions dictated everything. Who would die, how, when. And he was unraveling. Journals found hidden in his quarters told the story. Pages of Hafmat, scripture, anatomical drawings, diagrams of the human body with strange marks, cryptic notes about nodes of the soul. One entry from 1842 read, "The Spirit has revealed the soul is not in the heart, nor mind, but scattered, anchored throughout the body, awaiting release." By then, the Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't a congregation anymore. It was a slaughterhouse disguised as salvation. And no one on the outside had any idea. Not yet. If you're still with me, thank you, because this is where the nightmare deepens. Ever wonder how far people can go when they believe they're serving God? By the mid-1840s, the Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't just dangerous, it was a machine, a perfect, well-oiled engine of faith, fear, money, and death, hiding in plain sight. One of the Ravencroft brothers, Silas, found a way to solve a very real problem. Too many bodies. Their elevations, the ritual killings they called sacred, were piling up, and bodies, if not dealt with, attract questions. But Silas, he was clever. Medical schools across the country were desperate for cadavers. Executed criminals and unclaimed bodies weren't enough. That desperation created a black market for human remains. So Silas made a deal with death. Through quiet connections in Albany, New York City, even Philadelphia, he began donating, selling the bodies of their victims. In just 5 years, at least 67 people who had ascended were handed over as medical specimens. A euphemism for murder victims sold piece by piece to science. It was genius in the worst way. It erased evidence. It filled the church's coffers. And it gave Silas access to cutting-edge medical techniques, new ways to preserve flesh, new methods to inflict agony without leaving a trace. Every lesson made the next elevation cleaner, crueler, harder to detect. By 1845, what had started as a fringe sect was now something unholy and unprecedented. A self-sustaining system of brainwashing, ritual murder, and profit bore under the polite umbrella of religious freedom. But whispers were spreading. Too many members had vanished. Families joined, only to fade from public life. Those who left rarely spoke, not out loud. You could see it in their eyes, though haunted, terrified, silent, and then finally a thread began to pull loose. In 1847, a postal inspector named James Thornhill started looking into strange banking patterns. Large deposits, always cash. Transfers to medical schools, labeled vaguely as research donations. Odd, right? But that wasn't enough to expose anything. Not yet. Then he met Martha Simmons. She'd run from Ravenwood after watching her own sister chosen, elevated, in 1846. At first, she refused to talk. Too dangerous, too unbelievable. But eventually, the dam broke. And what she told Thornhill, ritual torture, underground chambers filled with bodies, children offered as blessings, never seen again. Thornhill wrote in his report, claims so. Outlandish, I would have dismissed them if they didn't line up perfectly with the financial irregularities already on record. The truth was clawing its way into daylight, slowly, terribly. And what came next would shake Ravenwood to its core. Before we dive into that part of the story, do me a favor. If you're hooked, if these hidden chapters of America's dark past fascinate you as much as they horrify, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment with the state or city you're listening from. It helps us bring more of these long-buried nightmares to light. What if I told you that one of the most horrifying cults in early America was almost stopped years before anyone even knew it existed? By the late 1840s, a quiet investigation had already started. James Thornhill, a postal inspector, had stumbled onto strange banking patterns tied to the Church of the Pure Spirit. He went to his bosses, but no one wanted to touch a church. Religious freedom was sacred law. Accusing a congregation of murder that would take more than suspicions. So Thornhill went underground. He built a network of eyes and ears in Ravenwood locals who could quietly report back. One of them was Dr. William Garrett, a respected physician in Albany. And what he discovered was chilling. The cadavers sent from the church weren't normal donors, not even close. They bore injuries that had started to heal before death, proof of torture. And every single one had died the same way, asphyxiation under extreme physical stress. In other words, ritual killings dressed up as medical generosity. Garrett documented everything. By 1850, he had medical reports on 7 bodies. He passed them to Thornhill, the first hard scientific evidence of what had been whispered for years. Still, no action, no warrant, no raid. Not yet, and then fate or madness cracked the case open. Prophet Caleb Ravencraft, whose mental state had been slipping for years, finally broke. According to later testimony, he began screaming about spirits in the walls, visions of divine anatomy floating in the air. His sermons turned wild, terrifying even to his most loyal followers. The brothers tried to hide him, locking him deep in the catacombs, far below where anyone could hear the screams. But on June 17, 1851, Caleb escaped. What happened next made headlines. Naked, bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, Prophet Caleb stumbled into Ravenwood's town square during a summer festival and started screaming his truth to the world. The blood of the purified strengthens our bond to God, he shouted. 27 vessels have been emptied, and soon all of you shall join them in glorious suffering. People froze. Some screamed. The sheriff detained him, thinking he was just a madman. But when he gave his name, when he claimed he was one of the Ravencraft brothers, everything changed. Thornhill rushed to Ravenwood. He interviewed Caleb personally. What he found wasn't a monster in control. It was a man shattered by the weight of what he'd done. Caleb drifted between silent trances and frantic, detailed confessions. He drew maps of the catacombs, marked hidden entrances, pointed out where the victims were stored. Finally, Thornhill had enough to act. A search warrant was issued. The church would be raided, but the brothers, Ezra and Silas, were already moving. Word of Caleb's capture reached them before the law arrived, and they didn't panic. They executed a plan. They called it the Cleansing Flame. Records later revealed what happened in those desperate hours. Inner Circle members removed incriminating documents, moved fresh corpses, diverted a nearby stream to flood key chambers, and then set fire to the church. Not to destroy everything, but to burn just enough to rewrite the narrative. By the time investigators arrived on June 19th, they found a half-burned church and a congregation playing the part of heartbroken survivors. Elder Ezra welcomed them with open arms. "It seems God has tested us twice," he reportedly said. "First, my poor brother's mind. Now this terrible fire. But faith will rise from these ashes." The investigation was a nightmare. Collapsed tunnels, flooded chambers, rooms scrubbed or stripped bare. But some secrets refused to stay buried. When the excavations finally reached untouched sections, what they found made hardened federal agents sick. Specialized restraints bolted to walls, surgical tools modified for pain, not healing, vats of chemicals used for preserving flesh. And then the Chamber of Saints, dozens of bodies, some skeletal, posed in prayer, others partially preserved, seated like worshippers in a grotesque congregation. The smallest alcoves held children, their tiny remains arranged as though at play, but the injuries told the truth. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood wrote, "The scene defies adequate description. It is as though death itself were turned into theater and humanity into props." What happened next would finally bring the Church of the Pure Spirit to its knees. Imagine opening your morning paper and reading this headline: "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House." That's what Albany woke up to on June 25, 1851. The story shocked even the most hardened investigators and Victorian newspapers, even while heavily censoring the grisly details, conveyed just enough to set off waves of public horror. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft, once respected religious leaders, were suddenly the center of a nightmare. But they didn't confess. Instead, they played the role of shocked innocents. They claimed that Prophet Caleb, their own brother, had conducted his ceremonies in secret, without their knowledge. They were horrified. They said, heartbroken. And for a brief moment, maybe someone could have believed them, until the ledger, hidden beneath Deacon Silas's private quarters. Investigators discovered a leather-bound book, a careful, handwritten record of every single elevation from 1829 to 1851. Names, dates, torture methods, what was done with the bodies, even notes about which remains were sold to medical schools. And most damning of all, it linked every brother directly to the crimes, including Elder Ezra, the man who had handpicked many of the victims. The case was no longer a mystery. It was a horror map drawn in the killer's own hand. On July 3, 1851, Ezra and Silas were arrested. Murder, fraud, desecration of human remains. The trial would become one of the most sensational of the mid-19th century. And yet, even with all the shocking revelations, not everything came to light. Not yet. As the summer of '51 unfolded, investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a cult. They had uncovered an entire criminal machine, one that reached into religion, medicine, and finance. Prophet Caleb was committed to the state asylum in Utica, considered too mentally unstable to stand trial. Ezra and Silas sat in custody, waiting. Their followers scattered, some hiding, some stunned into silence. Their entire faith shattered. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood set up a temporary command center in Ravenwood. Piece by piece, he started pulling together the puzzle. Old church records, testimonies, forensic findings, and what he found was chilling. The crimes didn't start in New York. Blackwood's confidential report revealed at least 3 previous communities: Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Ohio, dating back to 1817. Each one followed the same pattern. Establish a religious group, gather vulnerable believers, disappear before the law got too close. What made Ravenwood different wasn't what they did, it was how long they got away with it and how far they took it. Documents hidden in Silas's vault revealed name changes, theological rewrites, refinements. They'd been learning, experimenting, perfecting their system. And perhaps worst of all, they weren't working entirely alone. Letters recovered from Silas's correspondence with several medical schools hinted that some anatomists at least suspected, if not outright knew, that the bodies they were receiving hadn't died natural deaths. One letter from a prominent Philadelphia anatomist in 1844 praised the exceptional quality of the specimens, even noting, chillingly, these subjects show signs of systematic anatomical study prior to death, as though they were prepared for our work while still living. The truth was worse than murder. The Ravencroft brothers weren't just killing their followers. They were experimenting on them, studying how pain changed the body, recording how far the human frame could be pushed, then selling both the victims and the research to the medical world. Dr. Samuel Prescott of Albany Medical College later testified, the injuries, the preservation methods, the anatomical notes, this wasn't random cruelty. It was deliberate, controlled, a primitive attempt to map human physiology through suffering, and then a twist no one saw coming. In August of 1851, a respected Boston physician came forward with a revelation that rewrote the entire case. Dr. Jonathan Crane, a former Harvard medical student, recognized a name in the papers, not Ravencroft, but Simon Ravenwood. He testified in the 1820s. I attended a lecture by Simon Ravenwood, a man obsessed with pain as a gateway to religious ecstasy. I dismissed him as a disturbing eccentric, until I saw his face in the paper. Silas Ravencroft and Simon Ravenwood are the same man. The mastermind of the Church of the Pure Spirit had been hiding in plain sight for decades, experimenting, refining, preaching, killing, and the world was only just beginning to grasp the full scale of what they had done. Before we go further, into this chilling chapter of America's forgotten past, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next in the Ravencroft story will leave you absolutely speechless. Ever wonder what happens when religion isn't just twisted, but built from the ground up for something far darker? That's what investigators were starting to realize. The Church of the Pure Spirit hadn't been created to save souls, or even to control followers. No, it had been engineered. A belief system carefully constructed to sanctify something unthinkable, human experimentation. As investigators dug deeper, they found a secret chamber beneath Deacon Silas's private quarters, hundreds of notebooks, anatomical sketches, step-by-step procedures, observations written over decades. And here's what made it even worse. The tone changed over time. Early entries sounded like scripture. By the end, they read like lab reports. One horrifying entry from 1848 stood out. Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of redacted. Heart continued for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalizations consistent with prior trials. Blood loss measured at approximately 1.7 liters. Results support hypothesis regarding sustainability of vital functions under extreme conditions. This wasn't faith anymore. This was science at its most monstrous. When investigators confronted Elder Ezra with this evidence, something in him finally cracked. According to the interrogation transcript, he laughed for almost a full minute. Then he leaned in and said, "You understand nothing. The Spirit has many names. Some call it God, others science. We sought knowledge. Others were too weak to pursue. The elevation of our followers was genuine. They gave their lives for understanding, for progress. Bare suffering had purpose. Their deaths had meaning. It was a confession, but it was also a manifesto. News of the brothers' true motives rocked the medical world. Prestigious doctors and universities that had accepted specimens from the Ravencrofts suddenly found themselves under investigation. For the first time, America had to confront an ugly question. How far will medicine go when no one is watching? Meanwhile, the digging at Ravenwood continued. Prophet Caleb had claimed 217 vessels, but the ground told a different story. By September, federal investigator Daniel Blackwood reported, "We've identified remains of at least 276 individuals. Soil tests and the layout of underground chambers suggest more may be buried beyond the church property." The brothers were tunneling outward as their operation grew. And then another blow. Letters surfaced suggesting not every victim had even been a believer. Some were strangers, travelers, immigrants, people who wouldn't be missed. One letter from a church contact in a nearby town read chillingly, "The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel. No family, seeking work, strong constitution. I've directed him to Ravenwood with promise of employment at the mill. Expect him by Saturday." This wasn't just fanaticism anymore. This was organized abduction and murder for profit, for research, for doctrine twisted beyond recognition. And it raised a terrifying question. How many people helped make it happen? Then came the breakthrough that changed everything. In October 1851, investigators tracked down Samuel Parsons, the church's former accountant. He'd been living under a false name in western Massachusetts. Terrified for his life, granted immunity, he told his story. I thought I was managing donations and property deals. Then I found entries for specimen preparation and research, grants numbers that lined up with missing congregants. I started a secret ledger. When Elder Ezra found out, I was scheduled for special prayer counseling. That meant one thing: elevation. I ran that night with nothing but the clothes on my back. Parsons didn't just provide names. He gave investigators maps, financial trails to medical schools, wealthy patrons funding scientific work, even lists of church members who had played their part in the machinery of death. And then, one last revelation. Parsons spoke of a second site, 40 miles from Ravenwood, a farmhouse bought quietly in 1840, known only by one name among the brothers, the Garden. Only Ezra, Silas, and 2 trusted assistants ever went there. Supplies arrived at night, medical tools, chemicals, restraints, and sometimes subjects. None ever came back. When authorities raided the property, what they found dwarfed even the horrors beneath the church. The farmhouse was no farmhouse. It was a research compound, rooms for different experiments, records describing long-term procedures, weeks, sometimes months, keeping victims alive to test how far they could be pushed. And then came the worst part. A separate outbuilding contained small cells, restraints sized for children, at least 37 children, ages 4 to 16, had been held there between 1840 and 1851. That discovery ignited a firestorm. Newspapers that had once printed polite, censored summaries now ran full, lurid accounts. The New York Tribune didn't hold back. What happened next would turn a hidden horror into a national scandal, and make sure the name Ravenwood would never be forgotten. If this story has your heart pounding, share it with someone who loves uncovering the dark corners of history. Hit like, subscribe, and keep watching, because the last chapter of this nightmare is one you won't believe. Monsters, that's what the papers called them. Monsters in human form. The crimes of the Ravencroft brothers weren't just horrifying. They were almost impossible to believe. Innocent men, women, even children had suffered in ways no one could imagine. Public fury was immediate. Crowds filled the streets, demanding swift justice. Politicians, terrified of appearing weak, pushed for a prosecution that would send a message: this would never happen again. And inside their cells, the brothers started to crack. Elder Ezra, the calm, composed leader, began talking to people who weren't there. Guards reported he'd sit for hours, whispering to invisible figures. Deacon Silas tried to end his own life after being confronted with evidence from the garden. By the end of 1851, what began as a local nightmare had exploded into a national obsession. The trial promised not just justice, but answers, and maybe the truth about how something like this could even happen in America. But investigator Daniel Blackwood wasn't satisfied. Something about it all didn't add up. The brothers' crimes stretched across decades and states. He wrote in his private journal that December, "Too many victims, too much money, too many connections to the wealthy and powerful." There's no way they pulled this off alone. I fear what we've found is only the visible piece of something much larger, something that might still be out there." And he was right to be afraid. January 12th, 1852, Albany, New York. The trial of Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft began under armed guard. Thousands crowded outside the courthouse every day, some traveling from as far as Boston and Philadelphia just to see it with their own eyes. Newspapers called it the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside, the prosecution built its case carefully, piece by horrifying piece. Over 6 weeks, more than 100 witnesses took the stand. Survivors described how they'd been slowly, methodically drawn into the brothers' world, how rituals started simple and grew unspeakable. Doctors testified about the bodies, the torture, the experiments, the patterns that left no doubt. Accountants laid out the profits. Bodies and research sold like goods on a market. But nothing hit harder than the families. Sarah Wilkinson told the court about her daughter, Emma, just 16, when she joined the church in 1847. 6 months later, gone. She read letters in her daughter's handwriting. At first they were warm, hopeful, then strange, detached. The last one said Emma had been chosen for a special blessing, that her mother should rejoice in her coming elevation. "When I went to Ravenwood," Sarah said, her voice shaking, "Elder Ezra told me she was away, preparing for the ceremonies. 3 weeks later, he told me she had ascended. I begged to see her body. He said it was sanctified. It could not leave church grounds. In that packed courtroom, you could have heard a pin drop." Meanwhile, the brothers reacted very differently. Deacon Silas sat pale and silent, barely lifting his head, speaking only in whispers to his lawyers. Elder Ezra smiled. He'd nod sometimes, as if in agreement with the worst of the testimony, like someone admiring their own twisted masterpiece. Then came the defense, and it was bold, shocking even. They didn't deny the deaths, not the rituals, not even much of the evidence. Instead, they claimed all of it was protected religious practice. The Constitution guarantees freedom of religion. Their lawyer, William Hargrove, argued. These men led ceremonies that, while unusual, were voluntary. Their followers believed in purification through suffering. It was faith, not crime. But under cross-examination, that lie fell apart. Former church members testified about drugs, slipped into sacred wine, about manipulation, coercion, terror disguised as spiritual guidance. And finally, the records from the garden proved what everyone feared. Many of the dead had never even joined the church. They'd been kidnapped then, just when the trial seemed ready to close. Elder Ezra made a request no one saw coming. He wanted to testify. His lawyers begged him not to. The judge debated it for hours. Finally, permission granted, and what followed left the nation in stunned silence. For 4 hours, Elder Ezra spoke. No notes, no hesitation. It wasn't a defense. It was a sermon, a manifesto, a glimpse straight into the mind of a man who'd walked calmly past morality into the darkness beyond. He didn't deny a single charge. He didn't apologize. Instead, he preached a philosophy that married religion and science, the promise, part of transcending human limits through pain, suffering, and death. Death comes to all, he said to the packed courtroom. We merely gave it purpose, and for the first time, even the judge looked shaken. What happened next, the verdict, the sentence, and the final twist would shock the world. What if I told you the man on trial for some of the most horrifying crimes in American history wasn't ashamed? He was proud. Elder Ezra Ravencroft stood in a crowded Albany courtroom and spoke like a preacher delivering a sermon, not Peeler defending himself. For those who ascended through our hands, he said, their pain was brief, but their gift to humanity, eternal. The room froze. He talked about pain as pure consciousness, about death as nothing more than energy changing shape. He described the men, women, even the children, as volunteers in what he called the greatest scientific and spiritual journey of our age. Then came the question that cracked the room wide open. Prosecutor James Sullivan asked about the children buried in the garden. Ezra didn't hesitate. The young, he said calmly, received the Spirit more clearly. Their minds are unclouded. Their suffering shows us truths adults can't perceive. Gasps, cries. One man, Harold Winters, whose son had vanished after a church service years earlier, snapped. He charged the stand with a hidden knife, screaming for Ezra's blood. Court officers tackled him inches from the preacher's throat. Ezra. He didn't move, didn't even blink. You see, he said softly, almost smiling. Even now, the mere suggestion of truth provokes violence from the fearful. It's always been this way. That was the moment everyone in the courtroom realized. Elder Ezra wasn't insane. He was terrifyingly sane and utterly convinced. Deacon Silas refused to testify. His lawyer begged for mercy, claiming he'd been under his brother's control. The prosecution closed strong, hammering the betrayal, the cruelty, the meticulous planning. They reminded the jury of the children, the tortured bodies, the financial schemes, the perversion of both science and faith. The jury didn't take long. Less than 3 hours. Guilty on every count. On March 10th, 1852, Judge William Blackwood sentenced both brothers to hang. Their crimes, he declared, were an offense against God, against humanity, and against the moral foundations of civilized society. The execution date was set for April 15th. But history had other plans. First, Prophet Caleb, locked away in an asylum, turned up dead. Nervous exhaustion, the report said. Others whispered suicide or murder. Then the fire. April 7th, a blaze tore through the Albany jail. Smoke filled the corridors. 3 inmates and 2 guards died. Reports said Deacon Silas was among them, identified by his rings, Elder Ezra. Gone. The largest manhunt in New York's history began. Posters plastered every town. Federal agents joined the search. Sightings poured in from Chicago, Montreal, none confirmed. But the deeper investigators dug, the stranger it looked. The ID of Silas's body rushed, based mostly on jewelry, a bank withdrawal, nearly $30,000 made, just 2 days before the fire, by a loyal follower who vanished afterward. Blackwood wrote in a secret memo, "We must consider the possibility." Both brothers escaped. One corpse misidentified as Silas, another prisoner unaccounted for. The timing suggests planning and outside help. Then the murders began. June 1852, Baltimore. A doctor named Edward Mitchell, one of the physicians tied to the church, found dead in his home. Not just dead, arranged like the elevated victims. A note pinned to his chest. The spirit sees all who betray its work. Over the next year, 2 more doctors turned up the same way. Same pose, same note. Panic rippled through everyone connected to the case. By 1854, the official investigation slowed. Ezra was presumed gone, maybe overseas, but whispers kept surfacing. Strange sects in New Orleans, in St. Louis, in San Francisco, groups that looked familiar, practices that felt like echoes of Ravenwood. Nothing ever stuck. No arrests. No Ezra. Investigator Blackwood never stopped looking. Even after retirement, he kept digging. In his final report, he wrote, "The Ravencraft case didn't end the enterprise. It merely exposed it. The mix of religious zeal, scientific curiosity without restraint, and the promise of transcendence is too powerful to die with 2 men. I fear we've only driven it deeper into the shadows." And he was right. For decades after, stories surfaced. Groups with eerily similar rituals. Brief appearances. Sudden disappearances. Unexplained vanishings. Left behind like footprints in the dark. No proof. No Elder Ezra. But a pattern too strong to ignore. Somewhere out there, the work of the church, of the pure spirit, may have continued in silence, in secrecy, waiting, because the shadows of history still have voices. What if I told you that 10 years after the most infamous religious murders in American history, someone found proof? It might not be over. A quiet border town between Massachusetts and Vermont. A small church calling itself the Sanctuary, by divine understanding, found completely abandoned. At first, locals thought it was just another empty building. But investigators, following up on strange lights and noises, uncovered a hidden cellar inside. Signs of rituals, fresh ones, chillingly familiar ones. But the real gut punch, a journal. The handwriting matched Elder Ezra Ravencraft, and the last entry, written 3 days before the discovery. The work continues as it must. Every vessel contributes. Every elevation brings us closer to the final revelation. 100 years from now, when truth emerges, the world will see our sacrifice as the foundation of a new age. The Spirit is patient. Its servants must be too. Was it a farewell, a taunt, or just another disappearance before resurfacing somewhere new? We don't know. Ezra was never officially seen again, after the Albany jail fire. His fate, one of America's great unsolved mysteries. The government, stretched thin by the Civil War, declared the case closed. The files, artifacts, journals, file sealed in a Department of Justice archive, locked away where only a few officials could ever see them. Ravenwood itself never healed. The church grounds were seized, the buildings demolished, the land left empty. Many residents left, unable to bear the stain of living in a place the papers had christened America's House of Horror. Families of the dead formed a group, first called the Assembly of Reconciliation, later simply the Assembly. Their mission: hunt down and expose religious groups that turned faith into exploitation or abuse. But the real ripple effect went far beyond faith. The Raven case cracked open the ugly truth about medical research. Some of the country's top schools had unknowingly, or maybe knowingly, benefited from the brothers' atrocities. For the first time, people were asking hard questions. Where are these bodies coming from? Who's profiting from this? By 1855, the American Medical Association had a code of ethics. By 1858, states were passing laws to regulate cadaver use and medical research. Dr. William Harrison, the man who'd traced the brothers' reach into hospitals and labs, became a national voice for reform. In 1860, his treatise, The Moral Imperative in Scientific Inquiry, made it plain. Knowledge obtained through cruelty is poisoned at its source. Science without morality doesn't advance humanity, it betrays it. But Ezra's shadow didn't fade. Rumors of his survival kept surfacing. California mining towns, New Orleans spiritual circles, even European medical conferences. None confirmed, all unsettling. And it wasn't just whispers. From 1865 to 1890, authorities found at least 7 small religious groups scattered across the country, each echoing pieces of the Church of the Pure Spirit's teachings. Smaller, weaker, but proof that the ideology had escaped the men who birthed it. The biggest of these surfaced in 1879 in rural Missouri, led by a self-styled prophet called Brother Elijah. He wasn't Elijah. He was Thomas Whitfield, a former Inner Circle member of the original church. When police moved in, they found rituals, journals, symbols, all tied to the Ravencroft legacy. Whitfield chose death over arrest, taking his own life as the walls closed in. But the final gut twist came 2 decades later. Harvard Medical School library, by a locked iron box, delivered anonymously. Inside, journals, anatomical drawings, experimental notes, covering nearly 50 years. The most recent entries, handwriting experts confirmed, matched Elder Ezra's. The final page, dated December 31st, 1898, read, "As the century ends, so too does my work in this vessel. Age has done what the law could not. I go now to the pure spirit, content that the seeds we planted have taken root. The next generation will build on our foundation. The suffering was necessary. The knowledge remains. The spirit continues. A confession. a hoax. If real, it meant Ezra lived to 115. Unlikely, but not impossible. More disturbing than the question of authorship were the contents. Some of the protocols mirrored techniques used in legitimate medical research decades later. A quiet infection of science with roots in blood and ritual. Harvard sealed the collection immediately. In 1902, after consulting federal officials, the materials were moved into government storage, classified for 70 years. Meanwhile, the land in Ravenwood stayed empty. In 1923, New York declared it restricted. Fences, warnings, legends. People claimed the ground was cursed. Strange lights, cold spots, a silence so heavy it felt alive. In 1967, modern archaeology reopened the site. They found more, but hundreds more. The death toll, once believed to be 276, now estimated at over 400. Worse still, a sealed chamber, untouched for over a century. Inside, documents, plans, maps, not for Ravenwood, for expansion. The church had never been meant as a single place. It was supposed to be a network, nodes across the country, maybe beyond. And maybe, just maybe, Ezra kept trying to finish it. Today, more than 160 years later, the brothers' legacy still stalks American history. In religious studies, they're a case study in how faith, charisma, and the human craving for meaning can spiral into atrocity. In medical ethics, they're a warning, a reminder that just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be. In criminal psychology, they're an early, chilling example of organized, systematic killing, hidden under respectability. And for the family, it's still a wound. In Albany, a small memorial stands with just 10 words carved in stone. For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten. But the same questions that haunted investigator Blackwood in 1852 still echo. Now, who helped them? How deep did their influence reach? And how much of it is still with us, hiding in institutions we trust? The scariest part of the Ravencroft story isn't what they did. It's what it proves we're capable of when charisma, authority, and ideology silence our moral alarms. And somewhere in the quiet woods of upstate New York, the land where it all began still sits empty, scarred, silent. Some nights, locals say the air itself goes still. No birds, no crickets, no wind, just a quiet that feels alive, like the soil itself is waiting. Hungry. If this story chilled you as much as it fascinates you, let us know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the full truth ever came out, or is the real story still hiding in the shadows? Hit like. Share this with someone who loves dark history. And subscribe to Echoes of the Past, because the past is never really gone.